Hundreds of thousands of people, both locally and across the nation, gathered on Saturday to send a message to President Donald Trump. Denver's version of the Women's March was one of the largest in the country, with close to 200,000 attendees. The focus now turns to see whether this energy leads to action. David, I think even some of the organizers were probably surprised at the number of folks that showed up, not only in Denver, but across the country. What were your thoughts as you saw the protests?
That when we were on the eve of the 21st century, if somebody had made a political prediction that in the future Donald Trump will be president and the first major protest against him will be women wearing lady parts costumes, that would have seemed to me to be a very far-fetched kind of science fiction thing. Maybe a bad Saturday Night Live sketch or something equally preposterous. They were large crowds, unquestionably, and I think you can always get a significant crowd for abortion rights, but this was larger than that sort of typical crowd you can draw. I mean, it was enormous, and I think that tells you that when these issues come through Congress, cutting off Planned Parenthood funding, maybe federal restrictions on abortion, there is going to be a large citizen movement to push back at that. Now, they're heavily concentrated in large urban areas, which are not swing areas, so that somewhat reduces their political influence, but they're still going to be large and influential. Like on the other side, the same rally we're seeing today, the March for Life on Washington, which has always drawn huge crowds and usually not such wall-to-wall friendly media coverage. But so there's a large citizens movement on the other side of this as well. And for me, this shows the genius of the American political system if we enforced it, which is on things where we're supposed to have a Congress and national government that does certain things well, national defense, post offices, bankruptcy laws, and stays out of a lot of other things, like issues like abortion, for which I don't think the Constitution says anything properly interpreted one way or the other. And if we made it more of a state issue, then you wouldn't have to have this climactic battle where half the country is going to get a national solution imposed on it, contrary to its will. If we had more issues done at the state level, then you'd have the large majority of people living in places where the laws fit them.
Eric, what kind of effect can a protest and rallies like this have politically?
It has a tremendous effect. One, it gives people an outlet to vent, and obviously for Democrats who are still in a state of shock at this election that they never imagined that they were going to lose. Some elections, you're on the downside. This one, Democrats never anticipated being on the downside. Presidents who govern in a time of massive protest, it doesn't tend to end well for those presidencies. And I think that will be the story of this particular presidency. 4 years is a long time, and there will be ebbs and flows. But if you think of Lyndon Johnson and the protests then, that presidency ended with his withdrawal after the New Hampshire primary. If you think of Richard Nixon, and you can think of others as well, when there is that kind of massive activity in the street, it speaks to some deeper upheaval in society. I'm just stunned by the fact, Dominic, we are 7 days into this presidency. It seems like a lot more than 7 days. This kind of intensity, whether it's the intensity of the executive orders and the leather-bound cases coming out of the White House, or the intensity of the protest movement, or the intensity of the media outrage, it can't sustain. I mean, the flame can't burn that bright week after week, month after month. But yet, I anticipate that these protests, and they were large protests, they might be child's play compared to what's coming next week and in the weeks after the Supreme Court announcement. I mean, these were protests amorphous before there was really any specific policies to protest. We're about to have a Supreme Court appointment, whatever the merits, and it might be a local appointment, as I will note was my prediction at the first of the year show, that it might be a local judge going to the court. But whoever it is going to galvanize the protest movement if it is all a conservative appointee.
Penn, how does all this energy turn into action?
I think we'll see it once Congress sits down and starts to do something. But Dominic, I want to go on record with something. One weekend, let it be known, I'm going to agree with Donald Trump on something.
We'll write this down. Okay.
He's right. When you see all of the protesters, protesting is fine, but had they voted, they may not be protesting in the street. They might have a different president. I went to an economic summit this week, and one of the panelists said over 100 million qualified voters didn't vote in this last election. Enough said. We've now got a president who's fixating on whether the protest crowds are smaller than his inaugural crowd, which is odd. But I would submit that no set of alternative facts can change the fact that pictures don't lie. When you look at a picture of the mall during the inaugural and a picture of the protest, it's clear which was larger. I guess Photoshop is a set of alternative facts. You could Photoshop some more people in for the inaugural. But I think we're going to continue to see protests and opposition. I offer this to folks, to David's point. There's a reason why we are called these United States of America. The 11th Amendment notwithstanding, there is a presumption and understanding that we are bound together because of some common ideals, philosophies, and points of view. And finally, to Eric's point, I believe that if this president appoints someone who repeals Roe versus Wade, there's just going to be upheaval.
Patty, finish it up for us. What did you think about the tone and tension of all the rallies we saw?
It was remarkable, and I don't know if you were there. I was in Denver's. Two of my sisters with their daughters were in Washington, D.C. The first thing that we saw this weekend was that size matters. We know that Donald Trump is completely obsessed with that, and at the very time, he was so inappropriately talking about the crowd while he was at the CIA speech. Amazing crowds were gathering in Washington, in New York, in Miami, around the country, in Denver, where the count still, we know it was over 100,000. How much more? What was remarkable to me is the groups I was seeing coming in. Women, 20-somethings, women and men, who clearly had never really thought this all through and were marching down there. The women with their babies and signs on their babies marching down there. It wasn't whining. It wasn't so much a protest as a positive, we're together on this. David, there may not be anything in the Constitution about abortion, but there's not a whole lot in the Constitution about women either. Women who weren't able to vote. And I think we're going to see these women and their supporters, which I would hope includes everyone at this table, are going to continue pushing. And there are 3 events this weekend in Denver alone that are continuing to push the march rules, and I think they're going to stay active.